Okay, in chapter 45, we're going to talk about hormones in the endocrine system. And the main idea here is that hormones are used when signals need to be widely distributed. Okay, so that's the essential idea. So we're going to talk a little bit about the hormones and the endocrine system and how those affect the body. All right, so animals have two systems of internal kind of communication pathways that they can use to regulate their homeostasis or maintain that kind of internal environment of their body. And they use the nervous system and they use the endocrine system. The nervous system is the pathway for communication and involves high-speed electrical signals, okay, with the movement of potassium and sodium ions. And there's two portions to the nervous system. You have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and we'll talk more about those in the next chapter, okay? The endocrine system, however, is a system of the animal's hormone secreting cells. And what they're doing is they're making a product that gets secreted into the surrounding tissues, and then it diffuses into the bloodstream, and it coordinates a slow, kind of long-lasting type of response. Okay, the endocrine glands, as I said, they're hormone-secreting cells, and they're ductless glands. So in other words, what they're going to do is they're going to manufacture this product, and that product is going to get secreted into the extracellular fluid. It's going to diffuse into circulation, where it's going to get kind of pushed around the body, and it's going to have an effect on the target tissues. And if you recall, we have positive and negative feedback types of mechanisms that are going to control these hormonal responses. And if you remember, when we talk about positive feedback, what we have is the type of feedback where you get a response that leads to an increased response, which leads to an increased response, which leads to an increased response, and so forth. Kind of like the feedback that you get from getting too close to a speaker with the microphone or something like that. That would be an example of positive feedback. We also talked in class about how childbirth results or is the result of largely a positive feedback, where the fetus, as it's pushing on the cervix, is creating more contractions from the uterus, which is creating more of a push on the cervix, which is creating more contractions and so forth, all getting stronger and stronger, resulting in the birth of the baby. And then negative feedback, of course, we've said for a long time, is a lot like a thermostat. So you've got some sort of a set point, and for instance, in your house, if it gets too hot, then the heater's going to shut off, and then the temperature is going to slowly go down. When it gets too cold, the heater is going to kick back on, and then it's going to get warm again. It's going to shut down and so forth. So you can see that kind of oscillates about this set point right here. And we've talked about that, for a long time. And there's all sorts of ways. We've talked about the thirst mechanism. We've talked about, hunger. We've talked about a variety of different things in a way negative feedback can kind of control those. Okay. So molecules that function as hormones, there's three major classes. You have proteins or peptides, and these are water soluble. Okay, glucagon, insulin, leptin, those are some examples. Some amines, these are also water soluble. You have thyroxine and melatonin. And then steroids, which are a class of lipids, of course, which aren't going to be water soluble. And the common steroids are testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. We've talked about those a lot in class as well. So the key events that are involved in the signaling, you have reception, that's the receiving the signal, and it's going to bind to some sort of a receptor protein inside of the cell or kind of on the target cell's cell membrane. The cell receptors there, they can be, as it says, either inside or outside the cell, just depending on what kind of signaling molecules being used and so forth. And then what that's going to lead to is a signal transduction pathway. And this is where that signal is going to bind to that receptor protein, and it's going to trigger a variety of events inside of the cell. And that's often called a signal cascade or cascade types of events. And then the response is, of course, the change in the cell's behavior. It's going to either turn on the genes that are necessary to synthesize certain things, or it's going to turn off other things. There's a variety of things that are going to be involved. So an example here with the signal transduction pathway, you can see with this first messenger right here, what you have is it binds to, in this case, a G protein linked receptor. This is just a receptor molecule embedded in the cell membrane. And if you can recall back to, like, for instance, with chapter 7 from last year, we talked about the different types of proteins that are embedded in cells. And one of them was a receptor type of a protein. And what this does is once that signaling molecule binds, it's going to pass the information contained within that to another type of a protein. And then this is a G protein, which is kind of on the internal side, of the cytoplasmic side of the cell, and it's bound to the cell membrane. And then what this does is it activates still another kind of molecule or protein embedded in the membrane, and then it leads to kind of this cascade of events that's going to involve a second messenger, cyclic AMP in this case, and then that's going to lead to the activation of a protein kinase, which is going to phosphorylate things, and then what that ultimately leads to, as you can see in the bottom there, is a cellular response. So this would be like a signal transduction pathway, okay? And some of the activations of, some of the examples of these types of things are activations of enzymes, either the uptake or the secretion of a particular type of a molecule, rearrangement of the cytoskeleton. All of these types of things are basically involving this thing that we just talked about here in some sort of a signal transduction pathway. And these changes lead to this intracellular response, a response within the cell, and then that's going to lead to more of the extracellular response, some of the things that we might visibly see, for instance. Okay. Another example here is you can have these signals that are going to activate proteins either directly or indirectly. In the result of that can be perhaps the kind of the turning on of these genes, so to speak. Okay, so you get hormones, and these can cause a variety of changes within the different types of cells that are going to receive these. And the responses are, of course, a part of the signal transduction. So here you can see we've got some growth factor right here. And then what this does is it bonds to the receptor. Then you get this phosphorylation cascade of events. This is the signal transduction, okay? And then that is going to lead to the production of things that ultimately get inside of the cell and make this transcription factor active. That active transcription factor, of course, is what's going to turn on the particular genes. And if you recall in the past, we talked about all different types of cells contain all different types and combinations of transcription factors, and that's why certain genes can get expressed in some cells but not in others, despite the fact that all cells contain the same types of genes. Okay, they all contain your entire genetic complement, but only some of those genes get turned on, and that's because of the different types of transcription factors that we have in the cell. So some cells are going to respond to the growth hormone because it has the transcription factor that can turn on the genes. And other cells who lack those types of transcription factors may have growth factor present, but if it doesn't turn on the genes, then it's not going to respond, and the cell is not going to produce the types of things that other cells may be producing. Okay, so if you look here, you can see you have your secretory types of a cell up here. Let's switch colors real quick. So you have a secretory type of a cell up here. And what this is doing is it's producing some sort of a hormone molecule that gets dumped into the surrounding interstitial fluid. It's going to diffuse into the blood and then get carried to these target cells. And then it binds, just like we showed in that last slide, leads to a cascade of events here that can follow one of two pathways. It can either lead to a cytoplasmic response, okay, where it's going to influence the behavior of the cell without turning on the genes, or perhaps it does activate some transcription factors like we just talked about, resulting in the production of proteins by the transcription and translation of the genes within the cell. Okay, so there's two different types of pathways that it can follow. And then the other thing, the same types of events, production of the hormone molecule, sometimes these hormones don't need to have a cell receptor. What they can do instead is just diffuse all the way in and then bind to some sort of a signal receptor inside of the nucleus that can act to turn on the genes. And then you can see you've got the transcription here and the translation out in the cytoplasm of those particular types of genes. So some hormones are lipid soluble, some of them are water soluble, and how they kind of respond can really determine whether or not how they're going to interact with the cell, whether they're going to interact with certain things on the cell membrane or within the cell nucleus. It just, there's a variety of things that are there. If I had to say, I would say in A here on the left, this is going to be a water-soluble type of a hormone, and it's going to interact with a protein embedded in the membrane. And if I, again, likewise, if I were going to guess, I would say in B here, this would be, this hormone would be lipid-soluble in some way, shape, or form because it can diffuse right through the plasma membrane. And then, of course, the nuclear membrane and get in and cause that cellular response. Okay, it's not an absolute or 100%, but that would just be some information that might lead me to that type of a conclusion. Okay, so on the topic of water-soluble hormones, most water-soluble hormones have receptors embedded in the membrane, like I showed you here on the left with A. Okay, and then surface receptor proteins activate proteins in the cytoplasm, which can then move into the nucleus and regulate transcription, like I showed you here on the left. Okay, and then the lipid-soluble hormones, these have the receptor proteins located either inside the cell or inside the nucleus, you know, whether it's in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. And these things can, as I told you back here, diffuse right through the plasma membrane because they're lipids and they interact with the lipid tails of the membrane, and you know, they're not repelled and that sort of a thing. Okay, so what this does basically is stimulates transcription in much the same way that we talked about, the production of the messenger RNA, which gets processed, if you recall, and then it leaves the nucleus, enters the cytoplasm, where it's going to interact with the ribosomes and then manufacture the proteins that are needed according to, you know, why the hormone was released in the first place. Okay, so now if we talk about the thyroid gland, the thyroid produces two types of hormones. You have triiodothyroxine, okay, T3, and then you just have thyroxine, which is T4. And in mammals, T4 gets converted into T3 by the target cells. In T3, triiodothyroxine, that's the one that's mostly responsible for the different types of cellular responses that your thyroid gland produces. Okay, so thyroxine is secreted by the thyroid gland, has a variety of effects on the body. Okay, it helps regulate your metabolic rate, assists in controlling the body temperature, plays a role in the metabolism of carbohydrates, fats, proteins, those types of things, and it aids in the immune system. All right, so now your pancreas, you've got a lot of familiarity with this because we've talked about this a lot in class. And this is both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. Okay, the endocrine portion, of course, is what's going to put secretions that are going to diffuse into the blood, like we've been talking about. And the exocrine portion releases secretions into the ducts. So the pancreatic amylase, pancreatic protease, and the pancreatic lipase, those are all digestive enzymes that we've discussed. Those are exocrine. Those go through ducts, get secreted into the duodenum, of course, where the digestion is occurring, so that these things can get absorbed by the jejunum and the ileum in the small intestine. So the pancreas itself has islets of Langerhans, which are scattered throughout the entire exocrine portion of the pancreas. Okay, and the islets themselves contain alpha cells and beta cells. And the alpha cells produce the glucagon, the beta cells produce the insulin. In a way that you can remember that here is if you look at the A cells or the alpha cells, and there's an A in glucagon, but there's not any in insulin. So you can say that the alpha cells produce the glucagon, beta cells produce the insulin, and these two oppose each other and regulate the concentration of glucose in your bloodstream. So when you're hungry, you haven't eaten in a while, your blood glucose levels, this is an example of negative feedback, falls below a set point, the glucagon gets released, and that has an impact on the glycogen stores in the liver. And what it does is it breaks those down, dumps the glucose into the blood, increasing the blood glucose concentration. And then the glucagon level that's getting released, that starts to decrease. After you've eaten a large meal, you've got a lot of blood sugar, your insulin is going to get, insulin production will get stimulated. And what that's going to act as is like the key that's going to undo the lock and allow this sugar to enter into your, into the cells in your body so that they can be used in energy production and so forth. Okay, so when we talk about diabetes now, diabetes is an endocrine disorder because it's either caused by a deficiency of insulin or a decreased response to insulin. And the type of diabetes that you have is really kind of going to determine whether it's an insulin deficiency or kind of an insulin insensitivity or your decreased response to the insulin. So the two types are type 1, which is insulin dependent, and type 2, which is non-insulin dependent. And with type 1 diabetes, this is an autoimmune disorder. And this is where your body's immune system is going to destroy the beta cells. And Now your beta cells aren't going to be producing any insulin, and your body is going to require insulin injections in order to allow it to take up the sugars that your body is giving it. Okay, and there's a lot of people that have type 1 diabetes, and they often wear pumps, and the pumps can kind of monitor the blood glucose levels and respond accordingly with the amount of insulin that's going to be pumped in. Okay, type 2 diabetes is part of the epidemic in our country with too much sugar in our diet, and as a result of this, it's non-insulin dependent, is often referred to, and this is because you've got so much sugar and so much insulin that's constantly being released due to your diet that your cells are no longer responding to the insulin that's your body is naturally producing. So the best way to treat this is with diet and exercise. Cut out the carbohydrates, cut out the sugar, and exercise a lot, and try to make it so that your cells can then respond to the insulin that your body is producing. Okay, and then there's some medical steps that are also a possibility. But the best way to treat this is really with diet and exercise, especially at first. Okay, so your adipose tissue now, this is just recently learned, within the last 10, 15 years, is that leptin is a hormone that's secreted by the cells in your adipose tissue. And it acts on your hypothalamus gland in the brain, and what it does is it inhibits appetite. So if you're heavy or overweight, you don't need a lot of food, and that's because your leptin is being secreted. And what that does is it also regulates your energy metabolism. Okay, and it's often called the satiety hormone, because what it does is it makes you stop eating. If you've got enough food, etc. in your body, you don't need to keep eating more. If you've got a lot of body fat, you don't need to keep eating more, and that's because of the leptin. The leptin is going to help with that. Okay, ghrelin. This is the other hormone that's involved in eating, and when you have an empty stomach, your stomach's growling, that's when your stomach is going to be making, your body is going to be making the ghrelin, and it's going to work closely with the leptin to kind of control your appetites and your craving. Because when you're hungry, there's a lot of ghrelin that's been made. You can remember like ghrelin with your growling stomach, and that ghrelin is going to promote, you to want to eat, so that you can kind of satisfy that hunger. All right. Now the pineal gland, this is another gland that's found in your brain, and what it's going to do is, it's involved in making melatonin. And during the hours of darkness, this is when the pineal gland is starting to make a lot of melatonin, and this is what's involved in kind of controlling your circadian rhythm, your sleep-wake cycle, your mood, puberty when you're younger, things like that. And it responds to the kind of the different colors of light. So that's why like the blue light inhibits melatonin production and secretion. And so that's why you have the do not disturb on your phone, and it kind of changes the hue. It takes the blue light out so that you can look at your phone in the evening without hopefully disrupting this sleep-wake cycle due to kind of the interaction with the melatonin. Okay, so this is where we're going to leave off, and then next time when we pick up, we'll talk about sex determination and the Y chromosome. Okay, so we'll talk to you soon.